Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So what's going on in Ottawa? What's going on in Canada? What's going on in North America? Is obviously top of mind, dinner table conversation, coffee room conversation, and number one on the news. And so I thought I'd check in with two guys that have been very politically active, both in Canada, the United States, as well as worldwide historically, and I think are really plugged in to what's going on. And so I want to introduce you again to Nic Rakowski, as well as Murray Simpson, two individuals that have worked on Parliament Hill, have been involved in political efforts, and are now involved in business. Maybe I could just start with you, Murray. You have posted quite a lot recently about Donald Trump's threats, both from a tariff standpoint as well as absorbing us as the 51st state. And I think your frame of reference is that you spent a fair amount of time in the United States and really quite enjoyed your time there, and had respect for Americans, but decided to move back to Canada, and that you think Canada is a unique country and should be independent. Is that a fair summary, or what's your position, sir?
Oh, it's entirely fair. Grand proclamations like that, though, mean little. It's sort of the details that underlie it. I mean, we could have two totally different opinions about what it means to be independent in this case. But the nature of our relationship, as far as I'm concerned, was settled with the Treaty of Ghent. All right. And we're not revisiting it. That's number one. Number two, it doesn't matter who wants it. Okay. Canadians are prepared to defend it. And I think my whole position that I've been taking recently is you don't, when you lose, you don't lose the lesson. Okay. And in this case, does that mean that I enjoy Trump saying we're the 51st state and the rest of that? I'm Captain Canada. I was in the States with stickers on the back of my car. Okay. I stuck up for Canada like anybody would. And what he's done is he's stimulated the wrong way, of course, as a sort of tough guy bully, the Canadian underlying sentiment of independence. And that regrettably will not achieve his ends, I'm afraid. We've had 3 or 4 of these goes in 200 years, and we've never once, even at the threat of utter destruction and invasion twice, we fought back. And we will continue to fight back. And there's a gigantic monument, the Brock Monument, that people should go look at. Okay? We're not for sale, and we will not go easily into the night. Now, having said all that, as a good Canadian, and yes, I do believe our country should remain totally independent, there's a problem. You can't do that unless you're tough enough to back that up. And anybody who sort of knows me and my way in life, I mean what I say what I mean, and I don't play games, and I back that up by being tough enough to be able to say enough's enough with something and move on. If you can't say no to people, you have no power. And right now, Canada's anemic military and our anemic foreign policies and our lack of awareness that there are hegemons now running around real politicking this planet, if we don't take account of that, I'm suggesting to Canadians that we are likely to be on the receiving end of more of this, and I don't want it.
He has argued that the tariff barriers are such that we are gaining $200 billion a year in economic benefit, and Trump has said that he's not going to use military for Canada, unlike Panama and Greenland, where he hasn't ruled out military action. He said economic coercion. In your litany of things that we've got problems with, you mentioned military, et cetera. You didn't mention our economic situation. Will economic coercion work?
Well, the sort of short answer is it has an effect, because in game theory, it modifies the outcomes that are possible. Okay, the resulting risk and the resulting outcome is calculable with or without, for instance, tariffs. Okay, but the simple fact of the matter is that the fact that he said he's not going to militarily invade should tell us everything we need to know. Okay, we're enough of a turtle and a porcupine or Wolverine or whatever metaphor beaver that you want to use to describe us. You can't attack Canada and think that it's going to go well, okay? We will give you such a bloody nose. I don't care who you are, including China, okay? Don't pick a fight with us. We've never lost a bloody war in the history of our country, and nobody else can say that. Okay. And we fought everybody, everybody. Now, having said that, we need to be tough enough to be able to walk away if he does impose the tariff, because if he does, and there's a high probability he will, the only way to make this work is to respond in kind. And second, to get tough enough to solidify our economics by diversifying our client base. And this is a business thing. We will pay the maximum price with a 25% tariff on everything is a 5-year recession, roughly maximal destruction of maybe 10 to 15% of our economy. Is that a price worth paying to remain independent? I say yes.
Nick Rakowski, is a 10 to 15% destruction on our economy, a 5-year recession, a adequate price to stay independent?
I don't think that I want to answer the question that way, Brian, because I don't think we're in the world of a binary, and I don't think that the things that we're grappling with at this point are nearly as surprising as they have been made to seem. So I'm going to take a step back before I get into the question of what is the price that's worth paying for our independence, and just say everything old is new again. And I can tell you how that plays out in 3 separate dimensions. If you think about Donald Trump and you go to the early chapters of The Art of the Deal, the central tenet of the entire book is you always start your negotiation with your maximum ask and the scariest one, and the one that will make your negotiating partner the most uncomfortable.
Yep.
And you work your way down from there. So in a way, what he's doing is he's very bombastically playing from his playbook. And so I think we should all go back to reading The Art of the Deal and see what other lessons we can draw from that, because I don't think that he's charting a new course, and I don't think that he's behaving any differently than he has since becoming a public political figure in the mid-2010s. So that's the first, everything old is new again. The second is, in my lifetime, I believe this is, at the very least, the 4th time that we've had to grapple with some issue of significant concern as it relates to the theme of Canada's sovereignty vis-a-vis the United States. I'm reminded of Pierre Trudeau's famous quip that this is like a mouse sleeping next to an elephant, and whatever the elephant does disrupts us. And so we need to be nimble about how we protect our sovereignty while being pragmatic about dealing with the inconvenience of that next door neighbor who's outsized compared to us. I remember the 1984 and 1988 free trade elections, where the concept of just economic integration was terrifying to a good chunk of the Canadian electorate. And here we are all these years later, doing relatively well, all things considered.
Yep.
I remember all of the anxiety over whether or not Jean Chrétien was right to tell the Americans no about invading Iraq, and what price we'd have to pay for that.
Yep.
And so here we go again, I feel is what I want to say. And we have found a way through a combination of grit and creativity and pragmatism through each of those iterations of the complex Canada-U.S. relationship. At times, we've even had to invade the United States to make sure that we were okay. That goes back a little bit further than my lifetime, but the point is, I think that that's the case. And then the third dimension in which everything old is new again is, say what you will about Justin Trudeau. There are many questions that we can raise in the context of the next iteration of this conversation as it relates to Liberal leadership. But he and his team did a pretty good job the first time they had to grapple with a Trump transition and the likes of Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. And so I'm not that uncomfortable with the idea that we have at the helm, yes, on an interim basis, a prime minister who has stared down the mouth of the monster and figured out a way in the past. That's not to say that he's going to be able to implement the solutions that he needs to in the short term. But I think we have, between Trudeau, LeBlanc, the current Liberal cabinet, and the public service that has been part of that continuity since 2015, some pretty good insight and reliable insight into how to navigate these waters. So my take on this, once I get past the personal annoyance as a Canadian of having an American rub my face in it, is everything old is new again. And I think as long as we do the right things, we can move forward. And I'll pivot on that theme to this morning's Globe and Mail op-ed. I don't know if you saw what Jean Chrétien wrote to us for his 91st birthday. But the central point that I think he made that perhaps Donald Trump did not have in mind in his 25% tariff and or annexation of Canada, Panama, Greenland, and who else knows what, is that every person he pokes in the eye and every person he annoys becomes a potential ally for Canada.
Yeah.
And so rather than falling back on our own existential insecurities or our dependency on the United States, I think we've got a very refreshing reminder today from the former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien as to how important it is to lean into this moment, to go and find the other non-American allies in here who are equally aggrieved and concerned, and start playing laterally and diplomatically with them. And just to pull from one point that Murray made, it would be an awful lot easier to do that if we had a coherent foreign policy and a coherent public service backing that foreign policy moving forward.
Which you don't think we have today?
I think we're very desperate for a coherent foreign policy. I have yet to meet somebody in Ottawa who's able to articulate in 3 to 5 bullet points what the aims of Canadian foreign policy are. And if you've met them and if you know what they are, then I'm all ears. But I'm still not in a position to answer that question with any comfort level.
Murray, Nic has taken a far more nuanced and not as concerned attitude toward this threat than you, who were very strong in your opposition and wanting to suggest that we've got the military ability, the economic ability to withstand. How do you feel about Nic's more not lackadaisical, far from lackadaisical, but far more less concerned about the situation than you were?
Well, I think everything that Nic said is correct. I don't see any incongruity between what I've said and what he said. The simple fact of the matter is, if you're going to have a credible deterrence in Canada, there better be people like me on the backside of Nic. Okay, if he wants to go in and be diplomatic about it, that's fine. That's how
I just want to make sure that
that's how the engagement should be. But nobody on this planet should mistake Canadian niceness and diplomacy for an inability or unwillingness to fight.
So Nic probably...
Yeah, let me just jump in there. The beauty of podcasts is that we can do this in a bit of a messy way and not be edited out. So Murray said 3 things that I profoundly agree with, and the reason I didn't repeat them is just to be interesting, and I didn't want to cover the same ground as opposed to repeat them and agree with them. But I don't think it would have been quite as easy for Donald Trump to say what he said about 25% tariffs or further integration of our 2 countries. For example, if we were paying our full 2% of GDP to NATO on schedule, and with an idea of how to do that as intelligently and effectively as possible, and perhaps on a growth basis. That's a commitment that was made, as far as I know, roughly a decade ago, if not more. And we're still, not only have we never met it, we're still only projecting to meet it at some unspecific time in the future.
After 2030.
So that's the first thing where I agree with Murray, that shoring up our investment, our thinking, and our policy perspective on what to do with the investment that we will have to make in defense to defend our national sovereignty is a critical point. Chrétien talked about that today in his op-ed when he talked about the fact that one of the key diplomatic failures of Canada up until now has been the failure to get the Americans to recognize the Northern Passage as Canadian territory. But we don't have the muscle to back it up right now. So I agree with Murray on that. I agree that we need to lean into some of the more muscular measures that we could take on a tarification basis in a sort of tit-for-tat reciprocal challenge. In fact, there have been moments where I have wondered whether or not there aren't parts of the United States who we should remind that we literally determined whether or not their power grid lives or dies by virtue of the energy transmission. I'm not saying that we should prosecute all-out energy war at this point, but the lights do go on and off based on how Canada nourishes some of the northeastern and northern states in the United States from an energy grid. So we have some leverage there, and we should be demonstrating our willingness to use it. And then the third thing where I would say I agree with Murray is that to mistake Canadian collegiality for weakness is a mistake that many people have made. And, you know, to pull a sports analogy out of the hat, I know that Murray's not as big a fan of them as I am, but I think superpowers sometimes learn to their own detriment what it's like to deal with Canada when Canada has gotten to the point where, as Murray said, it's had enough.
Yep.
And I think we can remember the sheer horror of European commentary. If you go back to the Hockey Hall of Fame and you dive into the archives of what European journalists were saying about the behavior of the Canadian hockey team in the 1972 Summit Series when their backs were up against the wall.
Yeah.
Nobody was looking at as Canada's collegial, nice, friendly giants at that time. They were looking at us as a group of people who would do whatever it took.
Everything that is necessary.
And so there's no part of me that disagrees with that. I just think that what I'm trying to encourage us to do is think a little bit less emotionally and think a little bit more rationally in terms of how we tackle the problem. Because I've seen a lot of emotion in media, a lot of emotion in policymaking ranks, a lot of emotion in the punditry. But I don't know how useful that emotion has been. And it was very refreshing to get a very seasoned, old, but amazing politician's perspective on how we might tackle that moving forward this morning when I woke up and read my Globe and Mail.
We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Nic Rakowski and Murray Simpson talking about Canada-U.S. relations and how we deal with the incoming president, Donald Trump, in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.
So,
welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. It's my pleasure tonight to have two incredibly interesting gentlemen, Murray Simpson and Nic Rakowski, with me to talk about what's going on in Canada right now relative to the threats that Donald Trump has been making, both from a trade standpoint as well as an economic and a military annexation standpoint. Before we go further, and I wanted to really react to both what Murray and Nic has been saying with some quotes that I've heard. I wonder if each of you could introduce the other so everyone knows who's here. Nic, tell me a little bit about Murray, if you could.
Well, those of you who have a habit of listening to Murray, especially on political issues like Canada-US, may notice a certain degree of passion. And I guess I would start by saying that passion comes honestly because Murray and I first met in the early 1990s when I was a member of a student procession and demonstration holding a funeral for post-secondary education in Canada when Lloyd Axworthy was Minister of Education, and Murray happened to have found a way onto the stage with Lloyd Axworthy.
Excuse me, I was head of security, okay? I had some de minimis position.
In that moment, and so to say that Murray is passionately engaged on issues of importance to Canada would be an understatement. And what's best about Murray today is that he has leveraged that passion into trying to make a difference by doing for civic, democratic, and political causes what LinkedIn has done, in my view, for professional recruitment, which is to give people the social media instruments that they need to engage in politics in a constructive, respectful, and robust way that puts us all in a position to have a better dialogue about how to improve the country and the societies that we live in. So I'll leave it at that.
Murray, introduce Nic for us, if you could.
So you know how Nic and I met. We were both at we sound like we've done well in the world and we've existed, but we started out as poor students. Okay, we quite literally had craft dinner as a meme, and not much more money than that to eat at the time. But greatest time in the world, and yes, on Parliament Hill we were protesting, one of the largest protests ever on Parliament Hill to that point, actually. And I was a junior lieutenant in the organization of this protest, along with Nic. And I did end up on the stage, and my official title was head of security. And I ended up on the stage with Lloyd Axworthy, who had actually come out of Parliament to talk to us. The reason this is important is because not much has changed in my life. Everything I've ever done from that point forward led me to learn and appreciate what Nic's all about. Okay, and the thing you see between Nic and I right now is two different characters, two different personalities, two different ways of approaching problems. And he has built a career out of this in such a way that he's led some of the greatest organizations on the planet that have formed public opinion dating right back to the 90s. Okay. In addition to having worked on Parliament Hill, him as a proper staffer, me as a volunteer in Jean Chrétier's office was my inauspicious beginning. But from that career, Nic elevated himself into the greatest realms of business. And I believe the two of you ran the Ottawa Senators together back in the day. And so this career that Nic has had has been punctuated by representing some of the greatest minds, the greatest causes here and abroad, in Europe, in North America. And I'm delighted to say that we're still friends after all of this time. And now he is a great public affairs person and a well-known celebrity pundit.
Well, it's interesting that the two of you know each other from student politics or from a long time ago. I've met, as Murray, you've said, each of you more recently, and both in a business context, which is interesting. And Murray, I got to see present his online app for democracy that Nic was talking about in a venture capital pitch, and he wowed me as to his number one, historical knowledge of democracy, and then number two, what he was trying to do. And I interacted very intensely with Nic when he was taking over a business that was having some big challenges and needed to dramatically change it, both from a management standpoint as well as a leadership standpoint. And so both of you are impressive people. That said, I want to challenge you. I ended up having an opportunity to spend some time with David Frum, former conservative, very involved in Republican politics in the United States, speechwriter for one of the Bushes, and critic of Donald Trump, who spoke. And then I chatted with him after a keynote speech that he made about Donald Trump. And he said, number one, for those of you that don't take Donald Trump's threats of tariffs seriously, start to. He has been talking about the importance of tariffs since 1987. He took out a full-page ad in the New York Times in 1987 complaining about Japan and China and their unfair trade practices, and that tariffs were the answer. And it's been something that he's been talking about ever since. And he will institute tariffs. They may not be 25%, but they're going to be high enough that's going to devastate the Canadian economy. Number two, he said that, we've talked a lot about chaos. Black matter is a concept that I can best describe as what circles around Donald Trump on a fairly regular basis, because he will come up with ideas and policies based on whoever was the last person he talked to at a cocktail party or on the golf club or at his dinner table. And understand in history, we've always had to go through big processes to get to speak to the president. You had to go through a CIA briefing or review. You had to get invited to the White House. You had to go by security, etc. Now all you have to do is buy a membership at Mar-a-Lago or at a golf club, and you get to spend time with the president. And so therefore there'll be an Austrian businessman that will all of a sudden get information on how we're going to attack Iranian nuclear plants, et cetera, et cetera. So he says, think about chaos every day for the next 4 years, and something strange is going to happen. And then the last thing he said, which I think was really interesting, is he said that this migrant issue is probably something that he has adopted from a political standpoint because it's so critically important in the United States, and the build the wall ended up being very helpful to him, but he never did it. And so therefore, to Nic, your comments about, threats not being real, he said, but you don't have to actually do any of the deportations. You don't have to build the deportation camps. The impact on Canada is going to be just based on the rumor and the threat. And you are going to have a whole bunch of people that are going to want to leave the United States and come to Canada long before there's ever any reality to deportation camps. And so you better get ready for border, not going south, but coming north right away. And then
I'd love to jump in
finally,
when I
if I
can.
could, finally, and then I'll let you guys respond. He said, and so this is not the time for people in Canada to play partisan political games. This is the time for everyone to get on board with one very strong, unified, cohesive strategy on how to deal with the United States. So David Frum, maybe with a bias that is more anti-Trump than called for, but took Trump very seriously. How do you respond to that?
If I can jump in, Brian, first of all, I have to tell you that one of my favorite things to do is to read David Frum on virtually any topic, and especially Donald Trump, in part because he comes from a movement that I am not particularly aligned with, but he articulates his point of view on virtually every issue with a degree of clarity that I find extraordinarily helpful. And I should add integrity. The second thing I want to say is, just because I wanted to take a step back and contextualize before I leaned in, I 100% believe that there will be tariffs. I don't know whether they'll be 25%, 30%, 15%, 10%, but I believe they will happen. I believe that Donald Trump was speaking very literally when he talked about his willingness to leverage the United States' economic power to get concessions from Canada that would make the border, the artificial border, less relevant. And so there's no part of me that takes the Trump threat casually. What I'm trying to say is we don't get to the outcome that David Frum is pointing towards, a thoughtful, nonpartisan, national unity-driven response to a major threat to Canada without the kind of measure and deliberate thinking that comes from rationalizing your way through a difficult problem as opposed to emoting your way through a difficult problem. So I'm there. I will say that one of the things that's so concerning to me in the context of our current situation is that even though I think that there is benefit to having a prime minister and a government that has been through this before with Donald Trump, given Donald Trump's tendency to negotiate, starting with his strongest ask and with the most amount of leverage from the get-go, having a situation in Canada where for somewhere between the next 120 to 180 days, there will be no government that has a specific mandate to govern. And there will be a government that's governed by an interim prime minister, a new Liberal leader whose confidence will not have been tested by the House, and then eventually a new government that comes on the heels of that election. That's almost 6 months of stasis that I think Trump will exploit as joyfully as he possibly can to get to his ends. And so one of the things that I was heartened by, and I'm going to say this in a nonpartisan spirit, is to see certain people stepping up in what they immediately recognize as a vacuum. Doug Ford, who's no political friend of mine, did an amazing job of leading the rallying cry for a tough, pragmatic, united Canadian stance on this issue. I think he gets as much credit as anybody does for rallying the premiers to a meeting point next week with the Prime Minister. And his leadership has been rather remarkable in that part. And not that I want to segue us too quickly into the next portion of our conversation on the political landscape, but I contrast that with Pierre Poilievre, who's been far more timid in his response to the Trump shenanigans. And I wonder whether or not we're on the cusp of a moment in Canada where part of the pain that will be necessary to get to the united front that David Frum has in mind is for people to step up and lead when others are a little bit less inclined to. And so part of what I'm saying here is an appeal to Pierre Poilievre to be a little bit less tentative and a little bit more assertive about how he delves into this issue, because if he doesn't, he'll find himself surpassed by other leaders who are picking up the mantle of an issue that frankly will be far more important to any Canadian than the carbon tax election. So I'll just leave that as my final piece of food for thought on this particular matter before turning it back over to you.
I want to come back to leadership issues in a minute, but let's stay on dealing with Trump. Murray, what's your response to what I've said and what Nick has said in regards to dealing with Trump?
Oh, let's go back to sort of the David Frum principle of this sort of national unity sort of approach to Donald Trump. I'm actually vehemently opposed to that. I'm skeptical of any group of people that agree 100% on anything. And I think that that's potentially a suboptimal approach for Canada. Okay. I agree that when you're in war and you need to have a common front, but remember that our common front is that what comes out of the head of the government should in fact be tested. It shouldn't just be a group kumbaya, I hate Trump, so we're going to fight back. This is not what I'm suggesting, despite the fact that I'm passionate and always an advocate of negotiating from a position of strength. Okay, that doesn't mean that I disagree with Trump. The only thing I disagree with is a national unity approach. I actually think what has to happen is everybody needs to be brought together using the mechanisms of government, and the government has to lead. But here's the issue. That is the right approach. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. I want that approach to include the opposition testing whatever the government's going to do, as our parliament is designed to do. Now, having said that, okay, Trump will impose tariffs. What he's doing now is he's making a 10% tariff seem like a bargain. Okay, if you've ever fought with really powerful people, and I'm happy to tell you that all three of us have told a billionaire or two to go themselves when it didn't suit us. Okay, and this is the difference between the three people on say this and anything else. There's a point at which this is going to happen, because Trump will negotiate from his position of strength, and he's the largest economy, etc. That is not to be underestimated. But the inability to walk away, the inability to have a cogent plan from the government is what I take issue with. I think we all agree up to this point, okay? The issue is we don't have a government. And when I say that, I mean, our government is lame duck now, to use the American expression. The PMO does not have a mandate until a new leader is elected. And they get the confidence of the House to do anything. And that likely requires an election. I can't see us waiting until October with another minority government. But the fact of the matter is, Donald Trump is going to, as Nick said, pile on to a degree that's not going to be helpful. He's not interested in helpful. He's interested in getting a deal for the Americans. And I think everybody ought to understand from where that comes. Okay? I don't think that how we're going to fight about it, because we will fight about it with them. So what? We'll have a scrap. We're going to end up with some number. It's going to be awful. We may even get an exemption in the end. But in the end, you have to understand that this has been brewing since the free trade agreement. Okay, and in periods in the past, in the 19th century, in the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, this isn't new. You have to understand what America is to understand why Trump is so powerful with this. This isn't Trump's point of view, okay? This is Trump channeling the single largest point of view of any group in politics in the United States. Now, this is really important, okay? I lived there for the better part of my adult life. I lived all over the country, okay? Top, bottom, side, left, right, doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, there's a whole group of people who, for the last 40 years, with the international order being present, moved all the manufacturing out of the Rust Belt, moved all of what you would call the working class men in the United States out of the social strata. They don't have any self-respect left, and they're getting mad about it, pardon my French, okay? The idea that this is Trump inventing this problem is to misunderstand what's going on in middle America, okay, and the lower tiers of society, which are the largest portion of it. The working class in America has been decimated by globalization because the trade-off was lower labor for higher profits. That's what we've done for 40 or 50 years.
And cheaper international
goods.
goods.
The price are the lowest end of the spectrum, and they're mad as hell. Any politician that says, I'll hurt another country, will win every single time in the United States.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that all those articles that were written when Trump won the first time that said it was, a white lash, I think was the comment that on CNN was quoted, and that the Rust Belt had fought back for economic nationalism and jobs, etc., actually has come to pass all over again.
It has.
Fascinating. We're going to take a break for
and
some messages and come back, and I want to turn the topic to where we stand from a leadership standpoint, because I think I might have a slightly different point of view than the two of you on this topic as well. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Nic Rakowski and Murray Simpson on what the heck's going on in Canada in regards to Canada-US. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Really interesting conversation tonight with Murray Simpson and Nic Rakowski, talking about what's going on in Canada today relative to the threats and or frankly realities of Donald Trump, the incoming president in the United States, and what he wants to do in regards to tariffs and annexation of Canada or economic coercion or something like that. Now, I want to turn, if we could, to where we are from a political leadership standpoint, particularly in the Liberal Party, but generally as well. And Murray and Nic, you both talked about how we need a government that has a mandate. And I think that actually our current situation, people have said, is very negative. I think it's really positive. And the reason why I think it's positive, let me put forward my argument if I could, is that I think the world in March and maybe May or June, when we have either a leadership convention and an ultimate election campaign, is going to be dramatically different than the world we've got today and or a couple months ago. I think we could be in a trade war. I think we could be in a recession. I think we could be in a crisis from a foreign affairs standpoint, geopolitically, with what's going on potentially with Ukraine, the Middle East, etc. And I think that we need to have a leadership convention on that topic in the Liberal Party, and I think we need to have an election on that topic. And I worry if we had a strong mandate with a political party government today, it would have been fought last year on just inflation and axe the tax. It would have been fought on the debates of 2023 and 2024. And maybe, Murray, you're right. The last thing we want is an election in October. We need it in the spring. But I do think people's attitudes, even between today, January, and March, after the reality of the swearing in of Donald Trump and those first bills that he's going to pass, is going to be different. We are going to need and want a different type of prime minister than we would have in the past. We're going to want a different cabinet. We're going to have different skills. And I'm not sure whether that's going to be a Pierre Poilievre or Chrystia Freeland or Mark Carney or Christy Clark or whoever, but I think it's going to be different. And I think that we're going to need as a populace, the opportunity to think about that different reality. And last thing I'll suggest is I think we've had this before, where in 1937, 38, 39, no one would have dreamt of Winston Churchill as being the appropriate prime minister in the UK. But in 1939, 1940, he was the appropriate prime minister in the UK. You were there probably in 1992, 1993, the Chrétien government was elected, not even thinking about fiscal responsibility. In 93, 94, the Chrétien-Martin government was all about fiscal responsibility. Things change. And when things change, governments and leaders need to change. And so I think that this is actually going to be one of the most interesting elections, both within the Liberal Party as well as within the country, that we've ever had, and probably the most important topically. What do you think about that?
I think there is a need for a change of leadership in Canada. Some might point to me as an example of one of the Liberals who thinks that change is a bit overdue. So I agree with that. I think the part of what you said, Brian, that is the most compelling thought starter for me is the idea that things will have changed enough between now and March that the requirements of the leadership that we have, of the campaign framework that we have, of the national debate that we have, will have changed pretty dramatically. And I think what it means most concretely is that the leader of the official opposition and his team, who are most enthusiastic about being able to frame the election that they wanted as the carbon tax election is going to be a very different one, or has the possibility of being a very different one, if I want to be more realistic than now. And I'll simply speak from a personal perspective, not of knowledge and expertise, but of my own personal priorities and criteria for what I will be looking for in a new Liberal leader. The first thing is I want to see a Liberal leader that will have the kind of focus that has been lacking from prior governments. When you govern from a place of relative comfort, with the exception of COVID, which is one area where I might say that the former prime minister or the current interim prime minister shined because of the focus that was required of COVID. We need to return back to the kind of focus that will be laser sharp in my view, only three areas. The first is, how do we make sure that Canada, from an economic position, avails itself of policies and regulations and changes to those things that allow us to close the very persistent gap that has grown between Canada and the US on GDP per capita income, on the redistribution of wealth and R&D funding, for example, on a per employee basis between American companies and Canadian ones. In both cases, the chasm is huge. And so people in the business of policy will describe that as productivity, competitiveness, innovation. I don't care what label you put on it. I just want to make sure that we close that gap so that we have the tools financially to prosecute the challenges and the battles that are to come. It was Otto von Bismarck who I think said that money was the nerve center of war, and he's correct. And so a laser focus on that economic agenda and the economic growth is going to be extremely important. The second area of focus for me is the quality of the governance that we bring to bear. Now is no time to have a bunch of unsure of themselves, untalented, lackluster rookies at the helm. And so whether you are a leadership candidate for the Liberal Party or Pierre Poilievre or any of the other leaders that might have a role to play in the next election, I hope you're recruiting teams with that particular concept in mind, because I don't think we can afford the kind of kakistocracy that, for example, Donald Trump brought to bear in his first term as president. We need people who are going to get it right more often than not. And then the third area of focus for me is, are we able to articulate a vision of Canada at a moment where national sovereignty is going to be a critical issue that is more than we're not Americans? It gave me the wrong kind of chills, bad ones, to hear Justin Trudeau on CNN a few days ago talk about the fact that one of the things that's inherent to Canadians is our certainty that we're not Americans. Well, that's not good enough, and that's not going to make anybody feel any kind of inspiration to do what they've been doing in lesser and lesser numbers over the last 10 years, which is invest in Canada, create jobs in Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my first take on what I would hope to see come to fruition over the course of the campaigns that are about to follow.
Murray?
Well, look, leadership is what we do. Nick's right. I mean, it fundamentally, I don't even want to talk about this story. There is no leadership right now. Okay. And let's be crystal that the benefits started to outweigh the costs in the prior government when the government started to fight amongst itself. Okay. Because there was no real opposition. And you ended up with this sort of creep left thing with the Liberals, where they weren't the Liberals anymore. They were basically the NDP. And this caused, I think, the change in the benefit creation that the original 2015 majority government promised. Okay, so we've now gotten to the point where we've had a couple of years of sort of embarrassing missteps by absolutely everybody in government, which has left the country weak. The government does not have popular support. Let's be clear right now, despite having confidence of the House. These are two very different things. And it's when that breaks and those two things go in different directions that the Canadian political system becomes weak. Donald Trump's nobody's idiot. Okay, if we're going to be fighting this, whatever this is or whatever it becomes, that the number one thing you can do to get a good outcome is that the country's ready to fight. Nobody backs down from a weakling. So this is likely to get worse before it gets better. Now, as to what can come, what we need as a change in government, as Nic termed it, can come in one of two ways. The Liberals can reinvent themselves, which is increasingly unlikely that a leadership race at this very late stage, as you said, Brian, would change their fortune. But there is precedent for this across the Commonwealth and in other parliaments, that there's a come from behind. I mean, this could be a third period down by 2 goals, to use your crazy sports metaphors, Nic, that ends in the greatest success of all times. We'll see. But the more likely outcome is not that. The more likely outcome is that we come back into Parliament, Parliament remains sclerotic, there's a confidence motion, and we go to an election. And the reason for that is, right now, the Liberals, the Conservatives and the NDP and the rest, they're as powerful as they'll ever be from the standpoint of the electorate. Okay, the Liberals will only get stronger between now and the rest, because don't forget, Poilievre's been around for a long time. People are almost treating him like an existing governor, to use Trump's word. Okay, so the thesis now is the resignation of Trudeau gave a 5-point jump in Liberal fortunes. So now in the 20s for the first time since the summer. Okay. And this has emboldened the Liberals. So what you're seeing now is a lot of work going on in the Liberal Party right now to figure out how much more to the center can we get? How far can we go? Because this is the only universe in which they come out of an election with, say, 70 to 100 seats, is if they move to the center. It's the only way. And so the change in government's going to happen that way. Or more likely in a general election, and Pierre Poilievre will clean up. I mean, this is the outcome is a new Liberal leader that remains prime minister with an election, or Pierre Poilievre in a general election victory that is maybe not the supersized majority that it was going to be, but certainly he'll have a mandate. He may not hit the 50% popular vote, but in the first past the post system, he'll certainly get over 40. And that's quite enough to give him, high hundreds, to give him the majority he needs to do whatever he wants.
So let's go back to Donald Trump and how you deal with him. And let's take a final break and come back with some concluding comments from each of you. And I want to ask each of you, what do you think the new Liberal leader, whoever that person might be, and or Pierre Poilievre, what they need to do on January the 21st in response to whatever Donald Trump does? Stay with us, everyone. Back for some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Nic and Murray have been really excellent in giving us an overview of what the different potential responses might be to Donald Trump and his threats. And I want to ask each of you, tell me, if you were advising Pierre Poilievre and or the leaders, the leading leadership candidates for the Liberal Party, what do you say on January 20th, 21st, 22nd, if number one, Donald Trump does what he says, which is brings out immediately a very sizable omnibus bill that has included in it very negative tariffs or other actions against Canada? What's your advice? What should they say? Nic, let's start with you.
Well, at the risk of sounding too vague, what I think is missing right now is a reason to believe in Canada, an RTB. The single biggest symptom of the problem that you described, Brian, in summarizing your conversation with David Frum, that just the rumors are going to kill us. Look at the state of the Canadian dollar. None of the things that we fear have come to pass, but the speculation about them has driven it into the floor.
Yep.
So the very first order of business for any leader is to give people a reason to believe in Canada, and that starts with Canadians themselves, but it also builds out to others who have shared concerns with us. And That can be seen through the lens of foreign direct investment. That can be seen through the lens of local entrepreneurs like Murray and myself. That can be seen through the lens of people that are waiting for a signal from their leadership about what the best way for them to step up as premiers or ministers might actually be. And I have to say that I have been concerned by how uncomfortable Pierre Poilievre looks about engaging on the issue of this big new Canada-US challenge. I think he seems to me to be very hesitant to do anything that might put him too close to Donald Trump on the one hand or too far away from him on the other. And that kind of hesitancy is going to have to be dealt with at some point, because it doesn't contribute to, for example, my enthusiasm to have a reason to believe in the Canadian economy and Canadian strength at this point.
Murray, what would you tell a leadership aspirant in the Liberal Party leadership campaign and or Pierre Poilievre to say late January?
Well, I'll channel what they're being told. I talked to dozens of people that are giving this exact advice to this exact people, and they've all been told tack right. That's number one. Number two, dump DEI, dump diversity, dump all of this business in favor of a new national Canadian identity. Dump the post-national rhetoric. This isn't my advice, okay? This is the advice that collectively you're seeing everybody say, if you want to win, live to fight another day, to the Liberals, you need to go to where the people are. And this is really the advice that I would give now to the Liberal government if I were saying how you stay in office. Of course, I would say tack right. There's no question about that. Do you know that, in fact, they are tacking 180 degrees right as we speak in the Liberal Party to be able to face this off? And the leadership race is the perfect environment to be able to do it. It may seem like a snake shedding its skin and now it's still a snake, and it probably is that. But this is the system that we have. On the other hand, Pierre Poilievre, you know, there's a political calculus here, and there's also the Canadian national calculus. If I was advising Poilievre, I'd say hide. Okay, don't get in front of that bus for all the tea in China. Okay? This failure is going to be on your opponent's doorstep, not yours. So I don't agree, Nick, necessarily that he needs to be sort of a little more thing. But I will say this: if you have looked at some of the policies that he's put out, the most important policy that he put out, which I actually think is the correct policy, which is a Canada First policy on every level, just like the Americans. Instead of simply, we're going to retaliate, we're going to this, we're going to fight, we're going to be tough, look, we're turtled up. That's not enough. As Nick said, you need an ambition in the country. You need something to fire the spirit of Canadians, okay? I'm sick and bloody tired of people talking about us being a post-national state and Canada and Canadians is not a good identity. Bullcrap. I've been all over the planet. It's the greatest identity that's ever been created. And it's up to us to have that engine that drives us. And that engine has to be Canada first. Not international organizations or international law or peacekeeping or nonsense. You know what? People need to start to respect Canada. And the Conservatives, I got to tell you again, because just like in the United States, the disemboweling of the working class, from which I hail, and proudly so, okay, have been screwed in the deal that they've gotten in our system. And they're pissed off. And this is why people act as if populism is some sort of a overreaction of the uneducated or dumb. Let me tell you something. There's nothing dumb about people that haven't gone to university. Quite the contrary these days. They seem to be the only bloody people that can string together common sense. So on that note, I would say, Pierre, do what you're doing. And the Liberals, you need a total and complete reinvention. Vis-a-vis Trump, I think right now that if the Liberals are dealing with him and they really want to deal with him, we have an opportunity to use Prime Minister Trudeau, who doesn't care what happens to him now, to fight really hard on our behalf and let the Liberals in the background do their business with the leadership thing. So maybe JT actually threw himself on the sword. I've been thinking that, okay? And I think he did the right thing. He did it too late, but he finally did it, okay? And the fact is, he's now unencumbered to fight for the country. And I would say, Justin, get the hell out there and fight for the country. And the Liberals will earn credit for that work.
Nic, Murray, thanks very much. We're out of time. Excellent conversation. I think this is going to be one of the most interesting political times. It's going to be a little bit threatening from what the U.S. is going to do to our economy, but it's going to be a very interesting time to see how the Liberal Party, how the Conservative Party, how the NDP, how the Bloc Québécois respond to this situation, both from a leadership standpoint as well as from the upcoming election standpoint. And so I think it's going to be one of the most important times in Canadian history. I think back to that 1984, 1988, two elections on free trade. I think about the debates in the 1990s about our fiscal situation. This is going to be as important, if not more important, in our choice of leaders. And so I look forward to having a role in my small way with this show. And so I encourage you to keep tuned in. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you. Good night.